May 23, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon. Let me tell you something that hasn't gotten nearly enough. What happened in the Caribbean last week wasn't just another Latin American diplomatic spat. It was, without exaggeration, the worst naval move Venezuela could have made, and the consequences are going to ripple far beyond the region. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, and I can say with confidence that this is the kind of miscalculation that doesn't just escalate tensions, it reshapes alliances, redefines military postures, and accelerates the decline of American influence in ways we're only beginning to understand. Now, if you've been following the news, you've probably heard the official Venezuela, in a show of sovereignty, conducted a routine naval exercise near the Essequibo region, a territory it claims from Guyana. The US and Guyana called it a provocation. The Venezuelan government called it a defense of national interests. The media, predictably, framed it as another chapter in the long-running dispute over oil-rich territory. But here's the problem with that narrative: it's not just incomplete. It's dangerously misleading. Let me walk you through why. The official what they want you to believe. On the surface, this looks like a classic territorial dispute. Venezuela has long claimed the Essequibo region, which makes up about 2/3 of Guyana's landmass and sits atop some of the largest offshore oil reserves discovered in the last decade. When ExxonMobil struck black gold there in 2015, it turned Guyana into the world's fastest-growing economy overnight. Venezuela, already reeling from US sanctions and economic collapse, saw an opportunity to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from its own failures by reviving its claim. So when Venezuela's Navy sent patrol boats into waters near the Essequibo last week, the official line was this was a defensive maneuver to assert sovereignty over disputed territory. President Nicolas Maduro called it a peaceful operation and accused Guyana of being a puppet of ExxonMobil and the US State Department. The Venezuelan military released footage of its ships shadowing a Guyanese oil exploration vessel, framing it as a necessary response to foreign encroachment. The US and Guyana, of course, saw it differently. Guyana's government called the move aggressive and unlawful, while the US Southern Command issued a statement reaffirming its commitment to regional stability and announced joint military exercises with Guyana in response. The media dutifully reported the back and forth, with most outlets framing it as another flare-up in a long-simmering dispute. Nothing to see here, just business as usual in the Caribbean. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The hidden facts behind the move. First, let's talk about the timing. Venezuela didn't just wake up one morning and decide to flex its naval muscles. This move came weeks after the US and Guyana signed a new defense cooperation agreement, which included the deployment of US military advisors to Guyana and the establishment of a joint training facility near the Venezuelan border. Now, why would Venezuela react to that with a naval provocation now? Here's what's really going: Maduro isn't just posturing for domestic consumption. He's testing the limits of US resolve in the Western Hemisphere. And he's doing it with the backing of powers that have a vested interest in seeing America distracted. Let's look at the data. Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it once was: rusting ships, chronic fuel shortages, and a military that's more concerned with internal repression than external defense. Yet last week's operation wasn't just a few patrol boats drifting into disputed waters. Satellite imagery shows that Venezuela deployed multiple corvettes and even a frigate, assets it can barely afford to maintain, let alone risk in a confrontation. This wasn't a routine exercise. It was a calculated gamble. And here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela didn't act alone. In the days leading up to the operation, Russian and Iranian military advisors were spotted in Venezuelan naval bases. Now, why would Moscow and Tehran be involved in a territorial dispute between Venezuela and Guyana? The answer lies in what I've been warning about: for the emerging axis of revisionist powers is actively working to erode US influence in its own backyard. Russia has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela for over a decade, supplying arms, training, and even nuclear-capable bombers on friendly visits. Iran has used Venezuela as a hub for sanctions evasion and intelligence operations. And China? Well, let's just say that Beijing has a very keen interest in Guyana's oil, so much so that it's quietly pressuring Caracas to back off, even as it publicly supports Venezuela's claims. So what's the real game here? It's not about the Essequibo. It's about signaling. Maduro is sending a message to you: may have Guyana, but you don't control the Caribbean anymore. And he's doing it with the tacit support of powers that want to see the US bogged down in yet another regional crisis. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Caribbean. Now, let's out. What we're witnessing isn't just a bilateral dispute, it's a microcosm of the broader struggle for influence in the 21st century. The US is no longer the undisputed hegemon in its own hemisphere. Russia, China, and Iran are all making inroads, and they're doing it by exploiting America's strategic overreach. This isn't the first time we've seen this playbook. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union used Cuba as a forward operating base to project power into the Western Hemisphere. Today, Russia is using Venezuela in much the same way, except this time, the stakes are higher. The US is already stretched thin in the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Every crisis that flares up in Latin America forces Washington to divert attention and resources away from its primary strategic competitors. China, meanwhile, is playing the long game. It doesn't need to challenge the US militarily, it just needs to make sure that when the next crisis hits, America is too distracted to respond effectively. And what better way to do that than by keeping the US focused on its own backyard? Here's the US has no coherent strategy for Latin America. For decades, Washington has treated the region as an afterthought until a crisis erupts, at which point it scrambles to respond with a mix of sanctions, military aid, and half-hearted diplomacy. Meanwhile, China is building ports, Russia is selling arms, and Iran is cultivating proxy networks. The result? A slow-motion erosion of US influence that no amount of naval exercises can reverse. And let's be, this isn't just about oil. It's about spheres of influence. The US has spent the last 30 years trying to impose a liberal international order on the world, but the reality is that great powers have always operated within their own spheres. The Monroe Doctrine may be dead in name, but the idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's exclusive domain is still very much alive in Washington. The problem? The rest of the world no longer agrees. Military and strategic, why this is a disaster waiting to happen. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The US response to Venezuela's provocation has been joint exercises with Guyana, increased patrols in the Caribbean, and stern warnings from Southcom. But here's the none of this actually deters Venezuela or its backers. Venezuela's navy is weak, but it doesn't need to be strong to cause trouble. A single miscalculation, a Venezuelan ship ramming a Guyanese vessel, a US patrol firing warning shots, a Russian advisor accidentally getting caught in the crossfire, could escalate this into a full-blown crisis. And let's not, Guyana is not a NATO ally. The US has no treaty obligation to defend it. So what happens when Venezuela calls Washington's bluff? This is where the hawks in Washington get it dangerously wrong. They think this is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, a clear-cut case of aggression that demands a strong response. But the world has changed. In 1962, the US could blockade Cuba and force the Soviets to back down because it had overwhelming military superiority. Today, the US is facing multiple peer competitors, all of whom have a vested interest in seeing America fail. Let me be, I'm not saying the US should back down. But I am saying that the current approach, military posturing without a clear endgame, is a recipe for disaster. We've seen this movie before. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. The US intervenes with the best of intentions, only to get bogged down in a quagmire that drains resources and credibility. The difference this time? The stakes are even higher, because the adversaries are more capable. The domestic political why Maduro did this now. Now, let's talk about the domestic angle. Why would Maduro risk a confrontation with the US at a time when Venezuela is already isolated and economically crippled? The answer is survival. Maduro is facing the most serious challenge to his rule in years. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has gained momentum, and the US has been quietly supporting efforts to hold free elections. Meanwhile, Venezuela's economy is in shambles, with hyperinflation, mass immigration, and chronic shortages of basic goods. Maduro is desperate. And what's the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook? create an external enemy to rally the population. By escalating tensions with Guyana, and by extension, the US and Maduro is trying to shift the narrative. He's betting that a nationalist surge will distract from his failures and give him a pretext to crack down on dissent. But here's the it's not just about Maduro. The US has its own domestic political incentives to escalate. Florida is a critical swing state, and both parties are eager to prove their toughness on Venezuela. The Biden administration, facing criticism from Republicans over its handling of the border crisis, may see this as an opportunity to look strong. And let's not ExxonMobil has billions of dollars invested in Guyana. If Venezuela disrupts its operations, the pressure on Washington to act will be immense. This is how crises spiral out of control. Neither side wants a war, but both sides have domestic political reasons to escalate. And in the middle of it all? A small, vulnerable country, Guyana, caught in the crossfire. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let me lay out the three most likely scenarios, and why none of them are good. Scenario 1, controlled escalation. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela engage in a prolonged standoff, with both sides conducting military exercises and issuing threats but stopping short of direct conflict. The US increases sanctions on Venezuela, while Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Maduro afloat. Guyana's oil production continues, but at a reduced pace due to security concerns. The status quo holds, but the underlying tensions remain unresolved. This is the least bad outcome, but it's also unstable. The longer the standoff drags on, the greater the risk of miscalculation. And let's not Venezuela's economy is still collapsing. Maduro can't afford to back down, but he also can't afford to keep escalating. This scenario is a ticking time bomb. Scenario 2, limited military confrontation. Here's where things get ugly. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Iranian support, attempts to seize a Guyanese oil installation. The US responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets, while Guyana invokes its defense agreement with the US and Britain. The conflict remains contained, but the economic fallout is severe. Oil prices spike, and global markets icy. This scenario is more likely than most people realize. Maduro is desperate, and he's surrounded by hardliners who believe the US won't risk a full-scale war. The problem? They're wrong. The US will respond, but not in the way they expect. And once the shooting starts, there's no telling where it ends. Scenario 3, Great Power Proxy War. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, with Russian and Iranian backing, launches a full-scale invasion of Guyana. The US intervenes militarily, but China and Russia respond by increasing their support for Venezuela. The conflict spreads, drawing in other regional actors like Brazil and Colombia. Before long, the Caribbean becomes a battleground for great power competition. This scenario is unlikely, but not impossible. If the US overreacts, or if Venezuela miscalculates, we could find ourselves in a situation where the only way out is through escalation. And once that happens, the risk of direct conflict between the US and Russia or China becomes very real. Grand strategy: the folly of liberal hegemony. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. What we're seeing in Venezuela is a symptom of a much larger the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America can and should reshape the world in its own image. We've tried to spread democracy, enforce human rights, and maintain global order through military intervention, economic sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. And what has it gotten us? A world that's more unstable, more divided, and more hostile to American interests than ever before. The problem isn't that the US is weak. The problem is that it's overstretched. We're trying to maintain primacy in every region of the world, even as our competitors grow stronger and more assertive. And in the process, we're alienating allies, empowering adversaries, and exhausting our own resources. This isn't just my opinion. It's the consensus among serious scholars of international relations. The US is trying to do too much, and as a result, it's failing at the things that matter most. We're losing influence in Latin America, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. And the more we try to hold on to our dominance, the faster it slips away. Alternatives and what we should do instead. So what's the alternative? Let me tell you what should happen and why it won't. First, the US needs to accept that it can't control every crisis. Venezuela's actions are reckless, but they're not an existential threat. The best way to counter them isn't through military posturing, it's through strategic patience. The US should work with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia to contain the crisis, while quietly supporting a negotiated settlement between Venezuela and Guyana. Second, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as a secondary theater. If we want to counter Russian and Chinese influence, we need to offer the region something better than sanctions and military aid. That means investing in infrastructure, trade, and diplomacy not just when a crisis hits, but as a matter of long-term strategy. Third, the US needs to recognize that great power competition isn't just about military strength. It's about economic resilience, technological innovation, and diplomatic credibility. Right now, we're losing on all three fronts. We need to focus on rebuilding our own strength, rather than trying to police the world. Now, I know what some of you are. This sounds like appeasement. But let me be, this isn't about backing down. It's about being smart. The US doesn't need to fight every battle to win the war. Sometimes, the best way to deter aggression is to make it clear that the costs of escalation outweigh the benefits. Reflective, the danger of sleepwalking into crisis. Let me leave you with what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about oil, or territory, or even Maduro's survival. It's about the future of American power. The US is at a crossroads. We can continue down the path of endless intervention, or we can accept that the world is changing and adapt accordingly. The problem is that our political class is still stuck in the mindset of the 1990s. They think the US can afford to be the world's policeman. They're wrong. The longer we cling to this illusion, the more dangerous the world becomes. So here's my message to pay attention. This isn't just another news cycle. This is how empires decline, not with a bang, but with a series of miscalculations, distractions, and overreactions. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but power is only as good as the strategy behind it. And right now, our strategy is failing. The question: will we wake up before it's too late? Or will we sleepwalk into another crisis, one that could have been avoided if we'd only had the wisdom to see the bigger picture? That's the choice we face. And the clock is ticking. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's recent naval gambit isn't just a blunder, it's a symptom of a much larger strategic miscalculation playing out across the global south. Maduro's government didn't wake up one morning and decide to pick a fight with Guyana over the Essequibo. This was a calculated move, born of desperation, but also of a growing confidence that the old rules of the game no longer apply. And that confidence isn't coming from Caracas alone. It's being fed by a constellation of actors who see the US as a declining hegemon, too distracted by its own internal divisions to enforce the red lines it once drew with impunity. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about 61,000 square miles of jungle and offshore oil fields, though, let's be clear, those oil fields are a big deal. ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery in the Stabroek Block alone is estimated to hold at least 11 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. That's enough to make Guyana a top 20 global oil producer within a decade. For Venezuela, a country whose economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013, that kind of wealth is an existential temptation. But the real stakes here are about something even more: the future of maritime order in the Western Hemisphere. Here's the uncomfortable: the US Navy hasn't faced a peer competitor in the Caribbean since the Cold War. The Soviet Union's brief flirtation with Cuba in the 1960s was the last time Washington had to seriously contemplate a naval blockade or a show of force in its own backyard. Since then, the region has been treated as an American lake, a place where the US could project power at will, whether to interdict drug traffickers, support coups, or enforce sanctions. But that era is ending, and Venezuela's recent actions are the first real test of whether the US still has the will to enforce its vision of regional security. Consider the timeline. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum claiming sovereignty over the Essequibo, followed by the deployment of a naval task force to the disputed waters. The U.S. responded with joint military exercises with Guyana, including overflights by B-1B bombers, a move that was as much about signaling resolve as it was about actual deterrence. But here's those bombers flew from Dyess Air Force Base in Texas. They didn't come from the U.S. Southern Command's usual staging grounds in Florida or Puerto Rico. That's not a coincidence. It's a sign of how stretched American power has become. The U.S. can still project force, but it's doing so from a position of relative weakness, not strength. Now, let's talk about the military implications. Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it once was. The country's fleet is aging, its sailors are underpaid, and its maintenance budgets have been gutted by years of economic mismanagement. But that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. In fact, in a conflict, Venezuela's greatest asset might not be its ships at all, it's its geography. The country sits astride some of the most critical choke points in the Caribbean, including the Gulf of Venezuela, which controls access to Lake Maracaibo, home to much of the country's remaining oil infrastructure. A determined Venezuelan force could mine these waters, harass commercial shipping, or even attempt to interdict U.S. naval movements in the event of a crisis. This is where things get dangerous. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, not great power competition. Our naval doctrine is still built around the idea of uncontested dominance, but the reality is that even a weak adversary can complicate our operations if it's willing to take risks. Venezuela's recent actions suggest that Maduro is willing to take those risks. And that's not just a problem for Guyana, it's a problem for the entire region. Let me give you an example. In 2008, Russia sent a small naval task force to the Caribbean, including the nuclear-powered cruiser Peter the Great. The deployment was largely symbolic, but it said the U.S. doesn't have a monopoly on power projection in its own hemisphere. Fast forward to 2024, and we're seeing a similar dynamic play out, but with a twist. This time, it's not just Russia making a cameo appearance, it's China, too. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in the region, from port investments in AMA to military cooperation with Cuba. And while China hasn't yet deployed naval assets to the Caribbean in the same way Russia did, the infrastructure is being put in place for that possibility. Here's why that matters. The U.S. has long relied on its ability to control the seas to ensure the free flow of trade and to deter adversaries. But if Venezuela, or any other country in the region, starts to see China or Russia as a viable alternative to U.S. dominance, the calculus changes. Suddenly, the U.S. isn't just dealing with a rogue state, it's dealing with a rogue state that has powerful backers. And that's a recipe for miscalculation. Now, I know what some of you are. This is just another case of a weak regime lashing out. Venezuela is a basket case, and Maduro is a dictator clinging to power. Why should we care? The answer is because the rules of the game are changing, and the U.S. isn't ready. For decades, we've operated under the assumption that no country in our hemisphere would dare challenge our naval supremacy. But that assumption is being tested, and the results could be disastrous. Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, the US and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war over the placement of missiles in Cuba. The crisis was resolved through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic backchannels, but it was a close call. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just that the US could deter Soviet aggression, it was that even a small country in the Caribbean could become a flashpoint for great power conflict. Today, we're seeing a similar dynamic play out, but with a critical: the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon it was in 1962. That's the real danger here. The US still has the most powerful military in the world, but it's not clear that we have the strategy to match. Our political leaders are still operating under the assumption that we can afford to ignore the global south until a crisis forces us to pay attention. But that's a luxury we no longer have. The world is fragmenting, and the old rules no longer apply. If we don't adapt, we're going to find ourselves in a position where we're reacting to crises rather than shaping them, and that's a recipe for disaster. So what's the way forward? First, we need to recognize that the US can't afford to treat Latin America as an afterthought. The region is too important, both strategically and economically, to be left to the whims of autocrats and opportunists. Second, we need to rebuild our diplomatic and economic toolkit. Sanctions and military aid are blunt instruments, and they often do more harm than good. We need a more nuanced approach, one that combines deterrence with engagement, and that recognizes that the best way to counter Chinese and Russian influence is to offer the region something better. Finally, we need to accept that the era of American unipolarity is over. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but we're no longer the only game in town. That doesn't mean we should retreat into isolationism, far from it. It means we need to be smarter about how we use our power. We need to focus on building alliances, not just with traditional partners like Europe and Japan, but with rising powers in the global south. And we need to recognize that the best way to deter aggression is to make it clear that the costs of escalation outweigh the benefits, not just for our adversaries, but for their backers as well. The clock is ticking. Venezuela's recent actions are a warning sign, but they're not the only one. From the South China Sea to the Arctic, the world is becoming a more contested place. The question is whether the US is ready to meet the challenge. If we're not, we're going to find ourselves in a position where we're constantly reacting to crises, rather than shaping the future. And that's a future none of us should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's naval gambit wasn't just a foreign policy miscalculation, it was a desperate domestic survival tactic disguised as sovereignty. Maduro's regime is teetering on the edge of collapse, and the Essequibo provocation wasn't about Guyana at all. It was about buying time, rallying nationalist fervor, and distracting from the fact that Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013, according to the IMF. That's not a recession, that's a humanitarian catastrophe. And when regimes face existential threats, they don't just lash out, they manufacture crises to justify repression, consolidate power, and shift blame. Let me explain why this matters for the broader region. Maduro's move wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of calculated escalation, from the 2018 election farce to the 2020 parliamentary coup that installed a puppet legislature. The Essequibo dispute, which had been dormant for decades, was suddenly revived in 2023 with a referendum that 95% of voters allegedly approved, a number so absurd it would make Stalin blush. The timing wasn't random. Venezuela's oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted to 700,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The country is running out of cash, and the regime's only remaining revenue streams are gold smuggling, drug trafficking, and whatever crumbs it can extract from China and Russia in exchange for geopolitical loyalty. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just a bad leader, he's a hostage to his own survival strategy. The military, which controls the country's illicit economies, has no incentive to push him out. The opposition, fractured and discredited after years of infighting, has no viable path to power. And the international community, despite its sanctions and condemnations, has no real leverage. The US can impose more sanctions, but they'll only deepen the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans while the regime's inner circle continues to enrich itself. The EU can issue stern statements, but Brussels has its own energy crisis to worry about. And China? Beijing will keep propping up Caracas as long as it serves its long-term goal of undermining US influence in the hemisphere. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is a prolonged stalemate, one where Maduro doubles down on repression, the economy continues its slow-motion collapse, and the regime survives not because it's strong, but because no one has the stomach for the alternative. Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's not a small island with a disciplined revolutionary elite. It's a country of 28 million people with a broken state, a hollowed-out military, and a population that's already voted with its feet. More than 7 million have fled since 2015, according to the UN. The regime can't fix the economy, but it can keep the military loyal by letting them loot what's left. It can't win a war with Guyana, but it can keep the threat alive to justify emergency powers. And it can't restore democracy, but it can keep the opposition divided and demoralized. The wild card, of course, is the US response. If Washington overreacts, say, by imposing a naval blockade or greenlighting a covert operation, it could play right into Maduro's hands. The regime would use any external intervention as proof that Venezuela is under siege, rallying nationalist sentiment and justifying even harsher crackdowns. On the other hand, if the US does nothing, it risks emboldening other autocrats in the region, from Nicaragua's Ortega to Bolivia's Arce, who are watching closely to see how far they can push their own territorial claims. The sweet spot is somewhere in the targeted sanctions on regime elites, support for Guyana's defense without direct military involvement, and a diplomatic offensive to isolate Venezuela internationally. But here's the none of this addresses the root problem. Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro. It's about a failed state that's been decaying for decades, long before Chavez came to power. The country's institutions were weak, its economy was overly dependent on oil, and its political class was more interested in patronage than governance. The US and its allies spent years treating Venezuela as a geopolitical chess piece rather than a country in need of serious reform. Sanctions were imposed, but no one asked whether they'd actually work. Democracy promotion was prioritized, but no one wondered whether the opposition was up to the task. And now, we're left with a regime that's too weak to govern but too strong to collapse, a zombie state that's dragging the entire region down with it. The real question isn't what Venezuela will do, and it's what the rest of us will do about it. Because if we've learned anything from the past 2 decades, it's that failed states don't stay contained. They export instability, through migration, through crime, through geopolitical opportunism. Venezuela is already the largest source of migrants in the Western Hemisphere, and its collapse has destabilized Colombia, Peru, and even the U.S. southern border. If the regime falls, the aftermath could be even messier, with armed factions, drug cartels, and foreign mercenaries filling the power vacuum. And if it doesn't fall? Then we're looking at a slow-burn crisis that will keep simmering for years, draining resources and attention from more pressing global challenges. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a problem to be managed, not solved. But that's a dangerous assumption. Because in a world where the rules are being rewritten, the old playbook no longer works. We can't afford to treat Latin America as a secondary theater while we focus on Ukraine or Taiwan. The region is too important, too volatile, and too interconnected with our own security. And if we don't start treating it that way, we're going to wake up one day to find that the crisis we ignored has become the crisis we can't escape. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's latest naval stunt isn't just a tactical blunder, it's a symptom of a much deeper strategic miscalculation by Maduro's regime. The Essequibo dispute has been simmering for over a century, but this was the moment they chose to escalate, and they did it in the clumsiest way possible. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate headlines. First, the timing was terrible. Venezuela's economy is in freefall, its military is hollowed out by desertions and corruption, and its international credibility is non-existent. The only thing keeping Maduro in power at this point is the fact that no one, not the US, not the opposition, not even his own generals, wants to deal with the chaos of a collapse. So why pick a fight with Guyana now? Because the regime is desperate for a distraction, and nothing rallies domestic support like a manufactured crisis. The problem is, this isn't 1982, when Argentina could invade the Falklands and at least temporarily unify the country behind a nationalist cause. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it once was. Its navy, in particular, is a floating museum. Most of its ships are Soviet-era relics that haven't seen meaningful upgrades in decades. The idea that they could project power into disputed waters without embarrassing themselves was always a fantasy, and the fact that they tried anyway tells you everything you need to know about how detached the regime is from reality. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's government is not playing 4D chess. It's not even playing checkers. It's flailing. The Essequibo gambit wasn't part of some grand strategy, it was a Hail Mary from a regime that knows its days are numbered. The referendum they held in December 2023, where they claimed 95% of Venezuelans supported annexing the region, was a farce. Independent polls suggested most Venezuelans either didn't care or saw it as a cynical ploy. But the regime needed a win, so they manufactured one. And when that didn't work, they sent a few ships into contested waters, hoping the US or Guyana would blink. They didn't. Instead, the US responded by conducting joint military exercises with Guyana, Brazil ramped up its border presence, and even Colombia, Venezuela's supposed ally, quietly signaled it wouldn't back Maduro in a conflict. The whole thing backfired spectacularly, and now Venezuela is left looking weaker than ever. So what were the alternatives? A smarter regime would have recognized that the Essequibo dispute is a legal and diplomatic issue, not a military one. Guyana has the stronger case under international law. The 1899 arbitral award, which Venezuela has long contested, was reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice in 2020. The ICJ has jurisdiction, and Guyana has been methodically building its case. Venezuela's best move would have been to engage in negotiations, perhaps leveraging its oil reserves to extract concessions. Instead, Maduro chose to escalate, and in doing so, he handed Guyana the moral high ground. Now, any future talks will be on Guyana's terms, not Venezuela's. But let's out even further. The real question isn't whether Venezuela's naval move was a mistake, it's what this tells us about the broader collapse of Latin American statecraft. For decades, the region has been trapped in a cycle of populist strongmen, economic mismanagement, and external meddling. Venezuela is just the most extreme example. The U.S. has spent years oscillating between neglect and heavy-handed intervention, neither of which has worked. The Obama administration tried engagement, but when that failed, Trump pivoted to maximum pressure sanctions, regime change rhetoric, even a failed coup attempt in 2019. None of it brought Maduro down, but it did give him an excuse to crack down even harder on dissent. Meanwhile, the rest of Latin America has been too divided to present a united front. Brazil under Lula has tried to play mediator, but his government is too focused on domestic politics to push for real change. Colombia, under Petro, has shifted toward dialogue, but his own struggles with governance have limited his influence. And the rest of the region? Mostly just hoping the problem goes away. Here's the Venezuela's collapse isn't just a Venezuelan problem. It's a regional one, and it's getting worse. The country's oil production has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to less than 800,000 today. Its GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013. And its people are voting with their feet. Over 7 million have fled since 2015, creating the largest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has responded by tightening sanctions, but that's only accelerated the exodus. The Biden administration has tried to walk a fine line, easing some restrictions on oil exports in exchange for vague promises of electoral reform, but it's too little, too late. The regime has no incentive to negotiate in good faith, and the opposition is too fractured to present a viable alternative. So where does that leave us? The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a lost cause, a problem to be contained rather than solved. But that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we treat Venezuela as a basket case, it will become one. The alternative is to recognize that the status quo is unsustainable and that the only way out is a coordinated regional strategy. That means first, a realistic approach to sanctions targeting the regime's elites, not the population. Second, a serious effort to rebuild Venezuela's institutions, not just through elections but through economic and security sector reform. And third, a recognition that the U.S. can't do this alone. Latin America needs to take ownership of its own problems, and that starts with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico working together to isolate Maduro while offering a path to reintegration. The irony is that Venezuela's collapse could have been avoided. The country was once the richest in Latin America, with a functioning democracy and a professional military. But decades of mismanagement, corruption, and external interference have turned it into a cautionary tale. The question now is whether the rest of the region and the world will learn from it or repeat the same mistakes. Because if we don't, we'll be having this same conversation in 5 years, only with even more refugees, more instability, and more geopolitical chaos. And that's the real tragedy. Venezuela didn't have to end up like this. But unless we change course, it's going to get worse before it gets better.